Good evening and welcome to Sunday Evening Devotions. Tonight's story is from Genesis chapter 22. It's a story that raises a lot of questions for us, and it challenges us in many ways. It's the story of the sacrifice of Isaac, that God decided that he would, as the scriptures tell us in the beginning of that chapter, that God tested Abraham and called to him to sacrifice his only son, the son of promise. The interesting thing is, you read the story, that there's no question on Abraham's part as he loads up and is obedient and takes the supplies needed on a journey and goes away from home on a pathway, perhaps something like what we find around us, but obviously very different than that climate. He leaves the pack animals and the servants behind and takes his son and the wood and the fire and ascends up to the mountain to do the deed. And you remember the question that Isaac has for his father. He says, "Look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" And Abraham said, "My son, God will provide for himself the land for the burnt offering." And so they went together. And Abraham had a faith that God would provide in some way and somehow, that whatever it would take, that God would provide not only the offering. As he had provided Isaac, he would provide for Isaac, he would provide for the promise. And so they get to the mount, and we read the story, and Abraham binds his son and puts him on the altar and is about to sacrifice him when the angel of the Lord appears to him, and God says, "I know that you will not withhold your son from me." And he swears that he will keep covenant with him. And then as Abraham turns, he hears and sees a ram caught in the thicket, and of course God does provide a substitute for Isaac, and that ram is offered in Isaac's place. Now certainly this is a picture of the doctrine of the substitutionary atonement, that God provides a substitute for us, that God provided a substitute for Isaac. And we can see that, but the question remains is, why would God, who despises human sacrifice, require it? And I think what it is proper for us to understand in this text is that we imitate God. So what was God doing? In God's economy, God was going to sacrifice his son. He was going to sacrifice to his righteousness the Son of all of eternity, for you and for me. And so that is what's behind our text. And not only is God going to sacrifice his son that will come through Isaac in the human nature, but you see, God is bound by his word to Isaac. And so when God is commanding Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, what God is doing is saying, "I've already sacrificed Isaac, my son through him. And if I sacrifice Isaac, I'm sacrificing my word to you, my promises to you." It is the sacrifice, the death to our sinful nature, the death of ourselves to the purposes and plans of God. And so it's not just a mere human sacrifice to appease God, but rather the acknowledgement that God is going to sacrifice his only son, the son of promise, for Abraham, for Abraham's descendants, and for all those who have the faith as Abraham does, as we're told in the New Testament in Galatians chapter 3. Well, that's an amazing thing. You see, God doesn't take any pleasure in our sufferings. And in that suffering, we find that God is suffering, that we are in Christ suffering. And this has a whole lot to speak to us, particularly, for instance, in the First Peter's epistle about suffering, suffering for righteousness' sake. That we suffer in Christ, that God uses that suffering not only to sanctify us, but really what he's doing is putting to death our sinful and our human nature, even as Jesus' human nature would be put to death. Although it wasn't sinful, it was perfect for us. It was put to death for us. And so we in Christ suffer, and our nature dies in Christ, and we are saved in Christ. And so Abraham, as it were, really received Isaac back from the dead, because Abraham had gone on to, as it were, in his own mind and his own heart, given up his son, because he knew that God would provide. Now, there's a couple other points that we could make about this text, and we could probably preach many sermons from it, but it is the idea that God tested Abraham One way to look at that would be tempted. I would put it this way: God proved Abraham's faith. It was a test of faith, not to see whether Abraham had faith or not, but to prove it, to bring it, as it were, to a perfection, that he was willing to give up everything that he knew, everything he saw. He was willing to die to self, to live for the purposes of God. And the other point is that we've come to translate, as you heard me read in the text, where Abraham says, well, God will provide. The Hebrew word there is not provide in that sense of provision. It's that God sees. And we could put it this way, that God will see to it. God sees. God would see his active faith. God would see Isaac. God would see to it that the sacrifice was made. And of course, God did see. And of course, the place became called, God sees, the God who sees. And that's an important, I think, distinction. Provision is a way of getting at it, but it is the idea that God sees us in Christ. And so that while we suffer, while we die, while in this flesh we suffer, and God calls us to suffering, what we are doing is giving ourselves over to God, and God has provided for us. God sees us in Christ, and God works in us that perfection of faith as we trust in him. That's a hard thing to do, to give up our comforts, to give up what we know and what we see for the purposes and plans of God. But that's exactly what Abraham did. He knew that Isaac would be saved somehow. That is, that he would survive, that somehow God would provide through Isaac, even if they raise him from the dead, as we're told by the writer of Hebrews in Hebrews 11. That was his faith. And that needs to be our faith, that God will see us in Christ, and he will prove our faith. And it is through our union with Christ that God sees us. Well, that's good news. Good night.